Well, good morning. Um, and hello, Dana. Hello, Patsy, and any you others that are listening. We're glad to have you here. I want to say thank you again to BJ for giving me the opportunity to do this. It's been an enjoyable experience. As we started this morning, I thought it might be interesting to look at the first commandment and its meaning. In our hymnal, I thought it was really cool. It says, "As the head of the family should teach these in a simple way to his household." And I think those are some important principles also. But the first commandment says, "You shall have no other gods." And what does this mean? We should fear, love, and trust in God above all things. It doesn't say some things or a few things. It says all things. And this is a key issue in the study of Chronicles. Idolatry becomes the breaking point, if you will, of the people. There's a constant warning from God and his prophets about idolatry. So, as we begin our study this morning, let us remind ourselves that Chronicles is not merely a condensation of Israel's history or the repetition of the books of Samuel and Kings. Admittedly, there is some overlap, but the author of Chronicles is addressing a post-exilic community, a community of people that has seen their once proud country ravaged by a foreign army, their majestic temple built for Yahweh destroyed, their proud city and its walls crumbled and burning and lying in ruins. They've seen many of their countrymen slaughtered by the invading army, and they themselves have been hauled off to a foreign country to be subject to a foreign king. Yet through all of these things, God's promises remain true. So the author reviews history in a unique and particular way. He offers encouragement that indeed they are still a chosen people, God's own people. He addresses their conduct of the past and the conduct of their past kings and drives home the point that God's chosen people should act as God's chosen people, separate and distinct from the world. The key issue is always idolatry. No other gods before me. And history repeats itself over and over, even until today. So, even though we are not Israel, we are indeed his people. A people saved by the death of Christ and bound to him with that covenant of grace. There is much for us to garner from this history and its study. So I would pray that God would make his word crystal clear to us this morning. So we'll begin in 2 Chronicles 14. And Asa is noted immediately as a good king. You'll notice in the title of today's study, there was a comma and then the word but. So even though Asa is noted as a good king, immediately next week we're going to see a failure. And we must remember that all these kings that we're looking at, these kings are men, human beings and sinners. We all fail. I fail, you fail, we all fail. But today we will see a couple of references to the heart of Asa and the heart of the people. It's a key element of what we are studying. The Bible is very clear that God knows your heart. Jeremiah 17:10 says, I, the Lord, search the heart and test the mind, to give every man according to his ways, according to the fruit of his deeds. So God knows. These people did not fool God. These kings did not fool God. And you and I cannot fool God. So one of the things we'll talk about today, I think, as we look around at our nation today and all of the things that are happening, this issue of idolatry and fooling God is central to what's going on. So with that in mind, let's begin our study. Chapter 14 begins with, and Abijah rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. Asa his son succeeded him as king, and in his days the country was at peace for 10 years. And verse 2 says, Asa did what was good and right in the eyes of the Lord. In 1 Kings 15, the companion chapter to this, Asa is described as someone whose heart was fully committed to God. The ESV translation says that he was wholly true to the Lord. So the references we've seen to that before in our study would be that David was a man after God's own heart. Someone who, even though they had failures, tried to do what was right, committed to the Lord, listening to what God told them to do. Verse 3 then starts talking about what Asa did. And basically he's going to go in and reform the land. He removed the foreign altars and the high places, smashed the sacred stones, and cut down the Asherah poles. Now, a little bit about what happened here. High places were considered places of worship. And as you look back in Israel's history, they often worshiped at high places. But here, the chronicler is speaking specifically about the worship of foreign gods. The people had constructed temples and idols and those kind of things at these places, and they were worshiping them there. Sacred stones would be memorials, if you will, to these foreign gods. And these were not small stones. You can contrast this with oftentimes when we study the patriarchs in Genesis, there's mention of standing stones where they would stack stones one on top of another to commemorate some special event that happened at that place. So people following or coming there then would be reminded of what God did for his people there. But these are different, and they differ in the fact that they are memorials constructed to foreign gods. Like I said, it's not small stones. Even our headstones in a cemetery would be meager in comparison to what these stones were. Some of the commentators said that they might be so high as 20 or 25 feet. So to go in and destroy these stones was a work in itself. The foreign altars, obviously, that's self-explanatory. The Asherah poles would be symbols to the female goddess Asherah, who's associated with the foreign god Baal. And almost always when Asherah is involved, there is a cult of prostitution, a temple of prostitution, very evil, immoral kind of things. So Asa takes it on because he wanted to do what was good and right in the eyes of the Lord to destroy these things. Verse 4 says, he commanded Judah to seek the Lord, the God of their fathers, and to obey his laws and commands. He removed the high places and incense altars in every town in Judah, and the kingdom was at peace under him. Now, we have to remember, we talked about last week, that the author of Chronicles equates obedience to God to be followed by a blessing, disobedience to God to be followed by a punishment. One of the key elements of a blessing of God was for a nation to be at peace. In the history of these times, nations were always in conflict with each other, trying to expand kingdoms, invade kingdoms, do all those kind of things. So we have this southern kingdom of Judah, the northern kingdom of Israel, and you remember last week that Rehoboam had a conflict with Shishak, the king of Egypt, and the people had humbled themselves, and because they humbled themselves, he was allowed to remain as king, but much had happened in the surrounding temple and city. Much was taken from there. So now Asa comes in, does what's good and right, and attempts to restore the cities to what they were before. Verse 6 says, he built up the fortified cities of Judah since the land was at peace. No one was at war with him during those years, for the Lord gave him rest. Even though there was peace, because of the conditions of that time, any king at all, good or bad, would realize that it was necessary to fortify the cities on his border to prepare in the event of an attack. So verse 7, he says, let us build up these towns and put walls around them with towers, gates, and bars. The land is still ours. That's the reference to God granting that to Rehoboam. The land could have fallen at that time, but because of the people humbling themselves, Asa says the land is still ours. And here's the explanation. Because we have sought the Lord our God. We sought him, and he has given us rest on every side. So they built and prospered. I think there's a life lesson for us here. In very simplified terms, I would phrase it as seeking God gives us rest. Seeking the world ends in turmoil. Now, rest is not always equated with prosperity and no problems. Rest means that we realize God is in control and we are his children. So, if we get nothing else out of this, realize that seeking God is the key message in today's study for these people, and God responds when we seek him. He finds us. In verse 8, Asa had an army of 300,000 men from Judah, equipped with large shields and with spears, and 280,000 from Benjamin, armed with small shields and with bows. All these were brave fighting men. Zerah the Cushite marched out against them with a vast army and 300 chariots, and came as far as Marishah. Now, Marishah is about 25 miles southeast of Jerusalem. Asa went out to meet him, and they took up battle positions in the valley of Zephathah near Marishah. So here's the setting, if you can get it in your mind. Asa is outnumbered 2-1. There's a lot of debate about these numbers when you really get into the study of that. The Hebrew alphabet really didn't give a clear way to picture numbers, and oftentimes they used words that made these numbers inflate themselves, and I don't really want to go into that. That's kind of a deep study and really a little bit irrelevant to what we're talking about. Just simply put in your mind that Asa and his people are outnumbered 2-1. So the odds are against them as they gather here in this valley. You can picture that one army on one side of the valley and the other army on the other side of the valley. And if I'm in Asa's army, I'm looking over there and going, whoa, there's a lot of people over there. This doesn't look good. But look at Asa. Look at Asa's response, or Asa's plan of action, in verse 11. Then Asa called to the Lord his God and said, Lord, there is no one like you to help the powerless against the mighty. So immediately, Asa acknowledges the power of God. Also, the willingness of God, who is all-powerful, to help the powerless. Another key element for us to look at here is the humility of Asa in this process. Even though he has amassed all the fighting men he has, they are out here ready to go to battle. He realizes that without God's help, this is not going to turn out well. So he looks to God for help. A friend of mine says, I want to be desperate for the Lord. I think in this situation, it would be easy to be desperate for the Lord. But God commands us to be desperate for Him in good times and bad times. And here in a few minutes, we're going to see a warning to Asa and his people, but let's go on with Asa's prayer. Help us, O Lord our God, for we rely on you. We've done everything we can. We're prepared, but we rely on you. And then I love this next phrase. And in your name, we have come against this vast army. O Lord, you are our God. Do not let man prevail against you. Asa is saying here, this is not just about me and my troops and our country. God, this is about you. In our history, you have sustained us. When we call on you, you have answered. Asa realizes that basically what we have here is a battle against good and evil. And if you want to draw that out, you can look at that as spiritual warfare, good and evil, which I think is very prevalent in our lives today. And look what happens when Asa prays this prayer, verse 12. The Lord struck down the Cushites before Asa and Judah. The Cushites fled, and Asa and his army pursued them as far as Gerar. That's about another 25 miles from where they met to do battle. So they travel 25 miles to the valley to have the battle. They have the battle. They win. The Cushites begin to flee, and they follow them another 25 miles. Such a great number of Cushites fell that they could not recover. They were crushed, and here's a cool phrase, before the Lord and his forces. See how the chronicler gives credit to the fact that God was involved in this victory? The men of Judah carried off a large amount of plunder. They destroyed all the villages around Gerar, for the terror of the Lord had fallen upon them. Oftentimes in Israel's history, things happened where Israel was victorious that could not have happened in a natural state. God does things like that. He lets things occur where only he can receive the credit. And that's what it means here when it says that the terror of the Lord had fallen upon them. If you read back in the history of Israel, we saw that with Solomon when he was visited by the queen, and she said, obviously your God is a great and mighty and powerful God, and more powerful than other gods. So people acknowledge that. It says they plundered all these villages. Mine says, since there was much booty there. Now, booty probably meant a lot different thing back then than it does now, so don't let your mind go astray there. I think the ESV says they carried off the plunder. Don't condemn the children of Israel for what they did here. That's how the world worked in those days. When you were victorious, you killed the remaining people and you took their stuff and you took it back to your place. They also attacked the camps of the herdsmen and carried off droves of sheep and goats, and then they returned to Jerusalem. So everything's going pretty good for Asa. Now here's what we talked about last week also. In the remainder of Chronicles, you're going to see this where God moves the heart of some man to come and address the king. Remember that it could be dangerous, even fatal, to come and address the king in these times. Oftentimes, if the king didn't like what you said, he killed you. But God would put on the heart of these prophets to come and deliver his message to the king. Oftentimes, we only see them 1 or 2 times in here, but it's an important occurrence and it's noted in here. So chapter 15, mine is labeled Asa's Reform, even though we have just gone through a reform. The Spirit of God came upon Azariah, son of Oded. He went out to meet Asa and said to him, listen to me, Asa, and all Judah and Benjamin. The Lord is with you when you are with him. If you seek him, he will be found by you. But if you forsake him, he will forsake you. For a long time, Israel was without the true God. Now, this Israel is not a reference to the northern kingdom. This is a reference to the ancient Israel when they were still all one kingdom. For a long time, Israel was without the true God, without a priest to teach, and without the law. One of the functions of the priest, beside being in the temple, was to be out among the people, to teach them the laws, to teach them the ways of God. So when there were no priests and there was no one doing any teaching, naturally the people were gobbled up by the world and began to worship these foreign idols. I think that's key to what we talked about in the first commandment, what it says in the heading to that in our hymnal, for the head of the household to teach these kind of things. It's important that we know what these laws are. So God is saying to them, verse 4, in those other times, this is what the prophet is saying, but in their distress they turned to the Lord, the God of Israel, and sought him, and he was found by them. In those days, in ancient Israel, it was not safe to travel about, for all the inhabitants of the lands were in great turmoil. One nation was being crushed by another, and one city by another, because God was troubling them with every kind of distress. So who's in charge even when things are in a mess? Well, it's pretty clear here. God was in charge. God has always been in charge. God always will be in charge. Nations rise and nations fall at the will of God. It becomes difficult for this post-exilic community, and even for us today as we see what's going on in our nation, to realize that indeed God is in charge. But sometimes God uses evil kingdoms, evil kings, evil groups, as we see today, to serve as a sort of wake-up call to his people. And the wake-up call is this: abandon foreign gods, abandon your idols, and seek me, and I will give you peace, and I will give you rest. Sometimes these cycles take a number of years, and it becomes a challenge, especially in a country such as ours, where we've been blessed with prosperity and comfort. Complacency can be a very meaningful enemy against God and his kingdom. Complacency causes us to think that, and I'm certainly guilty of this, that I have done this, I have accomplished this, I have accumulated this. And it takes our focus away from the fact that God has blessed us with all those things. So verse 7 says, "But as for you, be strong and do not give up, for your work will be rewarded." So what did Azariah, in today's terms, what did Azariah say to King Asa and all these people? Do you remember last week when King Rehoboam built up all the cities, had everything fortified? He sat back, and the text told us he became secure and turned away from God. So God is sending this prophet to Asa, a king who is seeking God's heart. God is giving him a warning and saying, look, you just had this miraculous victory, all these things you've brought back. Don't pat yourself on the back and think that you have done that. I have blessed you with that. So what is going to be Asa's response? Is it going to be as Rehoboam, who felt secure and full of himself, or is it going to be as someone who is seeking God's heart? Very clearly in verse 8, when Asa heard these words and the prophecy of Azariah son of Oded, the prophet, he took courage. That means he realized that he had to continue what was going on. He removed the detestable idols from the whole land of Judah and Benjamin, and from the towns he had captured in the hills of Ephraim. Not only that, he repaired the altar of the Lord that was in front of the portico of the Lord's temple. Now, a couple of things here. You might say, well, he just removed those things in the previous chapter. And he had. But I think in those times, just as in our times, just because he removed them did not mean that the people abandoned what they had been worshiping. When those things were destroyed, Satan would still work on these people. They would probably come back and reconstruct the things that had been destroyed. So Asa now takes it upon himself to go back and redo what he has done previously. I think, look at James 4:10. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up. This, in a nutshell, is the prophet's message to King Asa. Don't become full of yourself. Humble yourself. So let's continue in chapter 15 then. Verse 9, then he assembled, he being King Asa, assembled all Judah and Benjamin and the people from Ephraim. That would be the country that, the towns that he had captured, Manasseh and Simeon, who had settled among them, for large numbers had come over to him from Israel when they saw that the Lord his God was with him. So people were deserting the northern kingdom. You'll remember when Jeroboam became king, we talked about this last week, in the northern kingdom, he completely did away with the covenant religion and sacrifice system that Israel had practiced. He erected calves and foreign idols, did not allow any of the priests to serve God. So many of those priests immediately came to the southern kingdom. Now it's following that as the people hear about what's going on here, they too are deserting the northern kingdom and coming down. Verse 10, they assembled at Jerusalem in the 3rd month of the 15th year of Asa's reign. Now, the 3rd month has significance to Israel's history. This was quite possibly the Feast of Weeks. It was known as the Days of First Fruit or the Feast of Reaping. It was one of the feasts that Israel honored annually by gathering Jerusalem. It coincides historically with the giving of the law in Moses' time. So the people gathered for this. And look what happens in verse 11. At that time they sacrificed to the Lord 700 head of cattle and 7,000 sheep and goats from the plunder they had brought back. So they sacrificed a portion of the plunder that God had blessed them with in this victory. This is their way of acknowledging that these things are of God. They entered into a covenant to seek the Lord, the God of their fathers, and here's the phrase, with all their heart and soul. All their heart and soul. This has been a transformation of the people, okay? All who would not seek the Lord, the God of Israel, were to be put to death, whether small or great, man or woman. Whoa, this seems a little severe, does it not? Well, look at Exodus chapter 2, verse 20. whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord alone shall be devoted to destruction. Okay, we have to remember here that when God chose his people, he gave them a spiritual law, but he also gave them a civil law. And the civil law was very clear that if you did not follow the ways of God, you were to be done away with, either executed or put out of the camp. Why would God do that? Well, it's the same reason that when they entered the Promised Land, he told them, when you conquer these people, destroy them all. He knew the heart of these people, as we talked about in Jeremiah. He knew that if these temptations remained, that the people would fall prey to these temptations. Yes, that might be severe. I've had the opportunity in my lifetime to address lots and lots and lots of young people. One of the things I always told them is, if you want to soar with the eagles, don't hang out with a bunch of buzzards. Invariably, when we associate ourselves with people who are not of God, you can say, God put me here to be a witness to these people and to be an example to these people. And that can be very, very true. But you also have to be conscious of the fact that the devil is present in these situations. And that spiritual warfare between God and the devil is acted out on a personal basis. And I look back on many of my failures in my life, and I'm sure each of you can look back in your past. And more often than not, the times when I failed, I was at places I should not have been, with people I should not have been with. So I think we need to take this warning very seriously. The church today does not have the right to execute someone who gets away from God. There are biblical doctrines about excommunication, not to rid ourselves of those people, but to bring to their attention, if I want to be a part of this, I've got to understand what's going on here. And hopefully they value that association enough that they want to come back. It says they took an oath in verse 14 to the Lord with loud acclamation, with shouting, and with trumpets, and with horns. This wasn't muttering into your shirt collar under your breath, yeah, God, I'll follow. No, this was a public display in a very loud and wholehearted manner, accompanied by music. That God, we are your people. We want you. It says they sought God eagerly. Verse 15, all Judah rejoiced about the oath because they had sworn it wholeheartedly. There is that phrase again, wholeheartedly. They sought God eagerly. They were desperate for God, even in this time of triumph. And then look at the phrase, and he was found by them. And here's another repetitive. So the Lord gave them rest on every side. King Asa also deposed his grandmother. Now the ESV calls her his mother, and you can research that back, whether it's mother or grandmother. Why did he do that? He deposed his grandmother, Maacah, from her position as queen mother because she had made a repulsive Asherah pole. Asa cut the pole down, broke it up, and burned it in the Kidron Valley. Now, because the valley is mentioned, most commentators say that probably this was not just a pole with the goddess Asherah at the top of that pole. Because the valley is mentioned, there was probably a temple here. A temple to Asherah, a temple where cult prostitution was practiced. So Asa went in, facing his own mother or grandmother, removing her from the throne and destroying this repulsive thing that she had constructed. I think this is true to what Christ tells us, that there will be divisions within families. When we follow God, Satan will not let that go, oftentimes without a fight. That's why, once again, I think it's so important that fathers and grandfathers accept the responsibility of teaching children and grandchildren God's ways. Verse 17 says, although he did not remove the high places from Israel, talking about the northern kingdom, he did not go into that kingdom. He had no jurisdiction there. Asa's heart was what? Fully committed to the Lord all his life. Even next week, when BJ is back and we immediately see him get out of God's will for a while, God will honor the full commitment to the Lord. How does he honor that? He honors that with grace and forgiveness. Back to what he's doing now, he brought into the temple of God the silver and gold and the articles that he and his father had dedicated. He's restoring the temple, in a sense, to a portion of the majesty and magnificence that it had before Shishak came and raided it. There was no more war until the 35th year of Asa's reign. So there were no major battles. It's important for us to remember that all the while Asa is king here in the southern kingdom, there is a constant skirmish going on between the northern kingdom and himself. It never really erupted into full-blown war, but there was that constant threat. And that's why the fortified cities were built on the boundaries. You see in this, the world ever present, and one wanting to gobble up the other. One of evil, one of good. And that's going to be portrayed very, very vividly next week. So I think as we conclude this, a couple of things we need to summarize and really just emphasize in our mind.